thank you all for joining our webinar today. My name is Tima Byro, and I'm part of the RDA Ireland team who is organizing the Meet the Expert lectures. And this is our second lecture that has become sort of a webinar series. So thank you for adjusting to this change. I will highlight just a few logistics points before I pass on to our moderator today, Dr. Sandra Collins, and of course to our speaker, Rebecca Grant. Please note that we are recording this session and we will make the recording available online over the upcoming days. Note also that you are by default in listen-only mode, and we kindly ask you to use the question box in your control panel to ask any questions that you might have. And you can do so at any point during the webinar, as we will have question and answer component following the lecture itself. We also welcome any feedback that you might have on the tool that we are using. There is a little bit of a flexibility in how the viewing is organized, so please make your choice on whether you will see the speakers or the presentation. So we welcome any suggestions that you might have on this. We are also using a hashtag Meet the Expert and the hashtag RDA Ireland if you are into tweeting about the webinar and the talk. So we welcome that conversation as well. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Sandra. Thank you very much again.
Okay, hello everybody. It's really a delight to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Sandra Collins and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. The National Library, working together with the Digital Repository of Ireland, delivers the Irish node of the Research Data Alliance. The RDA, the Research Data Alliance, is an international grassroots organisation that works together across the world to build the social and technical bridges to make better data sharing. We have more than 10,000 members now from countries across the globe. This series of Meet the Expert talks, we'd usually be holding them in the lovely seminar room in the National Library, which I miss very much, but we're delighted to bring it to you now online and maybe reach out further than we could from our own buildings. So it's a great pleasure now to straight away introduce our speaker. I've had the pleasure of working with our speaker across 2 different organisations for nearly a decade. I worked with her in the Digital Repository of Ireland and the National Library of Ireland. Rebecca Grant is Research Data Manager at Springer Nature, where she supports the implementation of standardised data policies across journals, and she manages the data-focused help desk for authors. She's an active member of the RDA for many years now, and at the moment she co-chairs both the Data Policy Standardisation and Implementation Interest Group and also the Archives and Records Professionals for Research Data Interest Group. And as if that wasn't enough, if she wasn't busy enough, she's also doing a PhD at University College Dublin. And I think her talk today is going to tell us about some of the fascinating research that she's doing in that PhD. So just before I hand over to Rebecca, can I remind you to tweet using the hashtag, and we would love to have your questions, and you can submit them throughout the talk and we gather them all up, and Rebecca will answer them all for us at the end. You can use the little question mark box to do that. So now I'm delighted to hand over to Rebecca and really looking forward to this talk.
Hi, thanks so much for the introduction, Sandra, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar, especially over lunch, although I do think maybe the concept of lunch has kind of lost all meaning at this point, but thank you. Okay, so we'll get started. So in today's webinar, I'm talking about a couple of different topics that I don't usually necessarily think about all at the same time. So as Sandra mentioned, I'm currently undertaking a PhD at University College Dublin. I have been since 2014, hoping to submit my thesis in September of this year. And my PhD topic is looking at research data management in Ireland, specifically from the perspective of an archivist. So what does an archivist bring to research data management? And at the same time, I'm really interested in seeing what's changed, what's happened in the period that I've been doing this PhD. So when I first started, I did a bit of a review of policy in Ireland around research data. That was back in 2014. Towards the end of last year, the start of this year, I've come back to look again to see what's changed. So I'm really interested in kind of mapping those drivers. Why have things changed here? What's caused this change? How do we compare to other regions, other countries in the EU? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that based on some of my PhD research. I wanted to broaden it out a bit then, so looking at the global researcher's perspective. So what are the impacts of these policies when institutions, when research stakeholders bring in data sharing policies? What does that mean for researchers, and how have researchers reacted to those changes? Because that's not completely aligned with my PhD research, I'm going to be pulling from some of the research conducted at Springer Nature, where I work. And I'm going to finish up by looking then at how do we move from policy mandates, having these requirements that require action on the part of researchers, to incentivization. So what would encourage researchers or authors at a journal to share their data, aside from having a policy that's requiring them to do so? So that's the broad outline of what I'm planning to cover in this webinar. So looking first at the Irish context, what's been happening in Ireland during the period of my PhD research. So these are some of the ways that I started thinking about what drives change in research data management. Obviously, I'm focused specifically on Ireland, but I think potentially you would see parallels anywhere in the globe. So obviously, across the world, there is this larger context for research data management and sharing. Why are researchers being encouraged to do this? So things like the open science movement, open access, are all creating this drive to share data that then filters down to individual regions and countries. I then started looking at the kind of broader legislative and policy change at an EU level. So that might be something like EU funding policy, maybe EU directives that impact on Ireland. Then how does that turn into initiatives or strategy at a national level? What impact does that have on Irish funders, on publishers, on Irish organisations? And then within our research institutions, so universities, how do we see that policy change happen? How are they impacted by the broader context? Something that I'm also quite interested in, and that I experience, I think, a lot more through my work as a research data manager, is how researchers themselves change practice, maybe without having policy requirements necessarily, but we do see a lot of individuals who, because they feel very strongly that research data management and sharing is important, can actually affect really great change at their in their lab, as part of their research group, or even in their university. And then what I was planning to finish with as part of this talk is this idea of moving away then from policy and towards the development of reward. So away from policy mandates and requirements and more towards the pull of rewards and credit. I also wanted to acknowledge, while I'm not going to talk about this today, I'm also quite interested in the role of open government data and what's happening in public service data sharing. So as part of my PhD, that is something I'm investigating, and I would say certainly there is at least as much strategic work, legislative change that impacts on open government data as the academic data that I'm focusing on here. So just looking at some of those drivers that I mentioned, the first really big one is Horizon 2020. So this was the European Commission's funding stream. It was funding research between 2014 to 2020. So they fund around 100,000 researchers across Europe at a cost of around 79 billion euro. So really big funding stream. from 2014, they began piloting this change to their funder policy that beneficiaries of grants from Horizon 2020 now needed to deposit research data that would be required to validate the results that they're presenting in related scientific publications. And they ideally would like to see their researchers doing this via a data repository. As part of this, also that meant that participating projects would be required to develop a data management plan. So this was piloted in 2014 and then came in across the board later. And it did mean that for many research teams, it was the first time that they'd been asked to develop a data management plan, to think about how they would share their data and plan for that across the duration of their research project. And what that meant was that institutions that were hosting these researchers now needed to begin supporting compliance with this policy change. So that could be through guidance they're providing to researchers, it could be their own institutional policy, it might be the provision of repository infrastructure. And then another really big change coming from the EU, which I'm sure we all remember from May 2018, was the introduction of GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. So this became part of Irish law as part of the Data Protection Act in 2018. So GDPR describes how individuals' rights over their own data, the ways that their data can be gathered, processed, by who, how long it can be kept for, but it also introduced regulations about how researchers themselves could gather data for research. So researchers now need to have a legal basis to gather that data, which might be something like the provision of explicit consent from their research participants. And again, institutions needed to support compliance for this, so support their researchers, provide information to their researchers on how they can comply. I've taken an example from UCD because that's my institution, that's where I'm doing my PhD. I also think they've done a really good job of providing this information to their researchers. So you can see when you navigate to their site on GDPR, they have loads of resources available for researchers to understand what has changed and also what the requirements are. So you can see there they have data management principles that align with GDPR. Okay, so something else I wanted to quickly mention is the National Principles for Open Access Policy Statement that was published in 2012. So this was a policy statement that was more looking at open access policy more generally, so not focused on research data, but supporting the principle that research publications should be available under open access licenses for anyone to access and use. But it did include this statement: the research data should be deposited whenever this is feasible and linked to associated publications where this is appropriate. And as far as I'm aware, it's one of the first national statements that actually touched on this idea of research data at all. And similarly to other policy change, other initiatives at the time, there's this suggestion that researchers should do something with research data. There's no mandate that that they have to do this. Sorry. So at the time, this was endorsed by a number of funders in Ireland, institutions, also government agencies. So then something else I wanted to mention was the National Policy Statement on Ensuring Research Integrity in Ireland. So this was first published by the Irish Universities Association in 2014 and then updated last year, 2019. So the focus of both of these statements is around research integrity, obviously, but they do both touch on research data storage, good research data management practice, and the 2019 edition actually greatly expands on what had been said about what researchers should be doing in terms of data management in order to support research integrity. Also acknowledging that research data is a valuable resource and should be organized, curated, and appropriately stored. So what we see generally across the board is this movement away from an idea that ideally research data underpinning a publication should be shared if possible, towards this idea that research data in themselves are intrinsically valuable and should be managed and stored appropriately. And also to mention, the 2019 policy statement does introduce the fair data principle, so supporting the idea that researchers should be looking towards fair when they're making their data available. So how do you map change over time? Because that's the thing that I was really interested in doing. There are so many more drivers that I could have talked about. In the interest of time, I just picked out a couple. But what I really wanted to do was to map this change, because I knew, because of the duration of my PhD, I had done this work in 2014, and I knew I would be coming back to it 6 years later to see what had changed. So if I'd been doing this work in the UK, it would have been really easy, because the Digital Curation Centre has this listing that they have both of university policies and of funder policies in the UK. So if you go to their website, you'll see a nicely ordered dated list of when all of the UK universities brought in a data sharing policy. Unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, that's not the case in Ireland. So I did my own mapping. So back in 2014, I was looking at the websites of these universities, basically. So acknowledging that in some cases there may have been other policy documentation available internally that I just couldn't find, that I didn't have access to. But at the time, what I found in 2014 was that of the 8 universities I checked, only 2 had a policy that mentioned research data at all. Both of those were in the context of good research practice, so it wasn't a separate policy around research data. And then one of the universities also provided some guidance to researchers in terms of how they could comply with the policy. Went back in 2020 and things had changed quite a bit. So now 5 universities have policies in place. I believe that one of the others that doesn't currently have a policy will be bringing one in very soon. And all of the universities now provide guidance to their researchers. So when I was doing this mapping, I was seeing, well, do they have a little bit of guidance, minimal guidance? Do they have very extensive guidance? Actually, nearly all of them have really extensive guidance for researchers. And I'm taking the example of UCD, it's my own institution. So you can see on the slide, I just grabbed their LibGuide. They've got a really comprehensive overview of not just the kind of more detailed information about things like funder requirements and data management plans, but also just getting started. So acknowledging that maybe researchers are still at this point being asked to do this potentially for the first time, and they need that kind of guidance in order to understand what is being asked of them. So I did the same thing looking at Irish funder policies. This was a bit more tricky because you can often find this kind of information from a funder perspective. It could be something they state on their website. It might be a research data policy that stands alone. It can be within the terms and conditions of their grant. So I did my best to see, could I find any information about what funder expectations were about data sharing, but acknowledging that I certainly could have missed something. I was just looking at those funders that had been signatories or supporters of the National Principles for Open Access in 2012. So I looked at 6 funders. Back in 2014, we had 2 of those 6 recommending data sharing. As far as I could see, the others didn't say anything about it particularly. Checking again in 2020, and now 5 of the 6 actually require it. So not only have they started making a recommendation that their researchers need to share, it's actually a condition of grant funding. So just to provide a quick example, this is some work that the Health Research Board is doing with the Go Fair initiative. And I think this is really interesting because, as I mentioned, over time, we see more and more of these strategic initiatives around fair data sharing. So moving not just from maybe recommending that researchers do something with their data, but actually giving a bit more specific information about what researchers should do to make their data really useful once they publish it. And I believe HRB are also working at the moment on a project around estimating costs for data management planning. So just to expand a little on the fair data principles, because I will come back to these from a researcher perspective, I say most of the people on this webinar are already quite familiar. There are a set of principles that were published in 2016 in the journal Scientific Data. So setting out quite high level principles around how data which is shared could be made findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And the FAIR principles, since they've been published, have gained so much support across the community. So say this slide is at least a year old and there were 119 organizations endorsing FAIR at that time, and I'm sure that's increased. So you can see publishers, RDA, Digital Curation Centre, which I mentioned, infrastructure providers. There's a lot of support for FAIR in terms of, I guess, providing these high-level principles for data sharing. So something else that I was interested in as part of my PhD research is not just kind of what's driving change, but what's actually happening at an organizational level. So in the context of this movement towards greater data sharing and maybe more requirements on researchers, how are organizations themselves addressing this? So I conducted quite a small scale survey in October 2017. I was interested in talking to organizations who were kind of active in this space, so were actively contributing to data management, data sharing focused projects at that time. So things like the data.gov.ie portal. I received responses from 11 organizations. I'm only going to touch really briefly on what I found in the survey, but I've made the data set available. So there's an anonymized version of the data that I gathered. I've got the DOI for Figshare there if anyone wanted to dig into it in a bit more depth. So these were my respondents. I had 4 third-level institutions, so that would be universities, 4 non-commercial state-sponsored public bodies. So if you are not familiar with that terminology, that would be something like the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland or Waterways Ireland. So there's just examples, that's not who responded. I had 1 national cultural institution, a local authority, and a government department. So I gathered a bit of information about what these organizations were doing. So in order to participate, they had to either be receiving data, so that might be through their work with researchers like in a university, or creating data themselves. All of them were also allowing access, and then they were across the board, there was various kind of levels of active data management happening. So some were doing quite a lot around digital preservation, some weren't doing anything, some were doing appraisal, some weren't. There was quite a bit of variance. I did ask them in the survey why they were supporting research data management at their organization, and at the time the responses I found a little bit surprising, like because they gave answers I hadn't thought of. So actually the most common response was that they were obliged to because of freedom of information requirements. So that would be kind of a precursor to GDPR. And also the PSI directive, so public sector information regulations, which would be, again, around how public bodies share their data and the kind of access that individuals should have to it. Only 2 of the respondents said that they manage data because of funder requirements to do so. So I had 4 universities responding. 2 of them said they manage data because funders require them to. No one actually in that survey at the end of 2017 mentioned GDPR. I did go back and develop a number of case studies with some of these organizations later. So after GDPR had come in May 2018, everyone was talking about it, but in 2017, no one mentioned it. I was also interested to see kind of at an organizational level, what kind of policy and practice is in place to support this kind of work. So I was asking about kind of what kind of more granular policies these organizations had to support the work that they were doing in data sharing and data management. So you can see the highest proportion had an access policy, some had policies around retention, disposal, collection. It kind of mapped against the practices that I saw. So most organizations provide access, most organizations had an access policy. There was 3 that didn't have any policies at all, and all of them said it was something they were planning to do in the future. So to kind of summarize at an incredibly simplified way what I just spoke about, and also the research that I've been doing, which is a lot more in depth. We kind of see the influence of things like EU policy and legislation, in turn having this impact on national strategies. Stakeholders, so funders and universities, then bring in these researcher-facing policies which are requiring researchers to do something. And then internally also develop organizational practices, organizational policies to support the work that their organization is now doing. What I hadn't captured so much in my PhD research is then what impact that has on researcher practice. So in the context of all of this policy change, what has that meant for researchers? As part of my role at Springer Nature, I'm part of the data management team, and we have contributed to and developed a number of surveys, white papers and reports over the past few years that I think give a bit of a better insight into what these impacts have been on researchers globally. So this is taken from a report called The State of Open Data that Springer Nature contributes to on an annual basis. So you can see in this survey, it was quite large scale, so it differed by year, but there's around 7,000 or 8,000 respondents each year. So you can see that purple bar for research data sharing happening frequently or sometimes is slightly increasing. So over time, the researchers who do share frequently has gone up. The researchers that share rarely or never has gone down slightly. So we can see that there is change happening over time. Researchers are more likely to share their data, and they're less likely to say that they never share their data. In another white paper that we published on practical challenges, so this was in 2018, we also try to dig in a bit more into the methods that researchers are using. So yes, they say that they're sharing, but how are they doing that? So you can see 62% had shared their data both privately and publicly, 36% only ever share it privately, and 2% only ever shared publicly. So what does that mean? We asked them what they meant by private sharing. So actually most researchers are sharing by email still. So someone will ask them for their data and the researcher will email it to them. Actually 40% are still using USB or flash drives, which again surprised me a little bit. So maybe you post someone a USB with the data that they were looking for. And then 39% are using file sharing services. So that might be something like Dropbox or Google Drive. Then in terms of public sharing, you can see more than half are still sharing in the supplementary information of journal articles. So that would be at the point where a researcher is publishing a paper in a journal, they choose to upload their data set as a supplementary file, which is then usually by the journal turned into a PDF. So yes, it's shared publicly, but it's not in a very useful format. Nearly a third are sharing their data on lab or personal websites, and then only a quarter are sharing in a repository or a data archive. So that small section of people who are currently sharing in a repository, that's what we're trying to increase, so increase that number. Something else I found very interesting in another one of the State of Open Data reports was asking researchers, are they familiar with the fair data principle? So you can see in 2018, 60% of researchers said they'd never heard of them. And this, you can see again, it changed by year. The pool of respondents in 2019 was over 8,000. And it had dropped a little bit by 2019. So 54% in 2019 had said they'd never heard of the FAIR principles. Again, you can see in 2019, the number who said they'd heard of them had increased very slightly, so nearly a third had heard of them. And then in 2019, only 18% of researchers said they felt they were familiar with them. And so I do a bit of researcher training as part of my role at Springer Nature, and I would say even those researchers who do feel they might be familiar with the FAIR principles, I don't often find that they know kind of in practice what that means for them. So they might have heard of them, know what FAIR stands for, at a high level understand what the FAIR principles are intending to accomplish, but they don't necessarily know what they should be doing in order to publish fairer data. So 5 Essential Factors was a report that was published, I think it was in 2019. And it was bringing together a lot of the survey data that we'd accumulated at Springer Nature over a number of years. So pooling that data together and then drawing some conclusions about what stakeholders in general, so not just publishers, but other stakeholders also could do to accelerate data sharing by researchers. And the one that I'm focusing on is better credit, but also identified we're having clearer policies, having explicit funding for data sharing, providing practical help to researchers, and training and education. So one of the things we were looking at was motivation. So what motivates these researchers to share their research data? So you can see 44% said it was their journal policy that most motivates them, 38% their institution's policy, and only 33% their funder policy. To be honest, I find that a little bit surprising. I would have thought funder policy would have rated higher. And also I think so when we as a journal publisher ask researchers what they find motivating, maybe they say, well, yes, it's you, it's the journal publisher. But you can see like the numbers aren't huge for any of them. It's less than half for all of those that find those policies to be motivating. We also asked some questions around credit as an incentive for data sharing. So only 9% of those researchers felt that when they do go to the trouble of sharing their data, that they get sufficient credit for it. 46% said they'd be motivated to share by getting proper credit, and actually that's higher than any of those percentages that responded to policy as being motivating. 55% felt they would value a data citation as much as a citation to their article. And 60% said that if somebody reusing their data meant that they were credited as a co-author, that would motivate them quite a lot or a lot. So what can we do with this information? I'm now going to talk a bit about a case study. So this is a project that I was involved with at Springer Nature. It only wrapped up in January of this year, and it was exploring a bit more this idea of incentivization or credit for researchers as a driver for data sharing. So at Springer Nature, part of my role has been rolling out standardized research data policies across our journals. So the project actually began in 2016. Currently, more than 1,600, actually I think it's about 1,800 now, of our journals have one of the policies. It is a slow but steady process, so on a weekly basis, more and more journals have a policy in place. So as an academic publisher, and it's the same across most academic publishers that I've seen, we do have a selection of policy types to choose from. So instead of just having one overarching research data policy as a publisher, we have 4 types, and it's up. In some cases, it's up to the journal's editorial team. In some cases, it's the journal imprint to decide which of the policy types is most suitable for their journal, for the discipline their researchers are working in. So you can see the type 1 data policy. It's encouraging data sharing, it encourages citation, but it doesn't require it. Type 2, we still encourage data to be shared. We encourage you to state in your manuscript how the data have been shared. Again, you don't have to do anything. The type 3 policy encourages data sharing and it requires you to state how the data can be accessed. And then the type 4 is the really strict policy. So in order to publish in one of those journals, you have to have put your data into a repository and you can expect that your data will be peer reviewed. So across all the policy types, we always recommend that our authors put their data into a repository, not in supplementary information or anywhere else. We always allow them to cite their data sets in the reference lists, and we provide a help desk. So again, in many cases, it could be the first time that a researcher has been asked to do something with their data. So we have a help desk that my team works on in order to support those authors who might not be sure exactly what they're being asked to do. So then just looking at that breakdown of what the actual implications are for these policies that our journals have, actually it's only those type 3 and type 4 journals that now have a mandatory requirement for an author to do something. So a third, that would be the type 3 journals, and those type 4 journals require that statement of data availability to be included. If you're not familiar with what a data availability statement refers to, I mean, it is what it sounds like. It's a section of a published paper where the author is expected to explain to a reader how the data can be accessed. So we do provide some templated examples that authors can use if they want to describe how their data have been shared. They don't have to use them. It's basically a narrative paragraph where you tell your readers how they can get to the data. And that could be on request, it could be in a repository, it could be a supplementary files. So this is a piece of like really cool research. It was only published in PLOS One maybe 2 weeks ago now, but the preprint was available for a few months before that. So it was a really large scale study of data availability across journals. So I think it was nearly 500,000 journal articles that they were looking at. The paper itself makes some conclusions around what the advantages are in terms of citation for a researcher if they do choose to link data to their article. This graph that's on the screen now is referring to data availability statements at BMC journals. So BMC is an imprint at Springer Nature. That black line you can see in 2015 is the point at which they introduced this policy that required data availability statements. And then after that, you can see that dark blue bar where authors hadn't been including statements in their manuscripts dropped significantly and down even further in 2019. So it continues to drop because this is mandatory now. What you can also see on this graph, though, is that, yes, the authors are now starting to include data availability statements, which is great because that's a requirement. But you can also see that they're not necessarily choosing to put that data in a repository. So still, we have quite high proportions of people saying, I'll give you my data on request. So that example of private data sharing that I mentioned. So it could just be someone emailing the data to somebody else. We still have people saying that they've uploaded their data as supplementary information. And then a small, but I guess slightly significant proportion are putting their data into a repository. And what these authors are doing are completely aligned with the policies of that journal. They're not doing anything wrong, but we would hope over time that more authors would see the benefit of putting data into a repository. So this is what our Open Data Badges pilot was trying to investigate, whether we could look at a BMC journal which had this policy that required data availability statements and see could we do something extra that would motivate or incentivize those authors not just to add their data availability statement but to put that data into a repository. We then had a couple of sub-aims of the project. So we wanted to see, well, is there any increase in reader engagement? So are there other impacts apart from just the data goes into a repository? Are there positive impacts to having badges on a published paper? And also to establish the resources required. So if this was a really popular initiative, if it made a huge impact, how could we roll this out across other journals? So as I mentioned, we ran the pilot from 2018 and we just finished up in January of this year. And actually I say finished up, but we're more looking to see how we could bring this forward, possibly with a bit more automation. So the idea of badging an author's paper or badging an author for following good practice isn't new. It's not something that Springer Nature came up with. Probably the most high-profile examples of badging for journals come from the Centre for Open Science. So they have 3 different badges that acknowledge that authors have followed open practices. So that could be open data, open materials, or pre-registration of their study. For the Centre for Open Science Data Badge, authors are expected to disclose a couple of pieces of information. So they're expected to provide evidence that the data have been put into a repository. And also they have to show that there's sufficient information available to an independent researcher to reproduce the reported results. And then in some cases, if a journal chooses to use these Centre for Open Science badges, they might also decide to undertake peer review. So that would basically mean if an author tells you they've done this, that somebody checks that, but that's not necessarily a requirement. So there is some evidence that the use of these badges can have a really positive impact on data sharing at a journal. So in 2014, the journal Psychological Science brought in these badges and saw an increase in data sharing. It had been 3% of their authors sharing data in their papers, and that jumped to 23%, and then the following year to 39%. And this was also an increase in data sharing at Psychological Science compared to other similar journals in the same discipline. They did award their badges on the honour system, so not using that idea of peer review. And then a paper about this project, so Kidwell in 2016, did note that when they went back and checked, actually the number of those authors who should have gotten badges was probably fewer than had claimed that they deserved one. So for our Open Data Badge, we did change the criteria slightly. So we're not exactly following the same criteria as the Centre for Open Science for a number of reasons. I think actually we're investigating how we might circle back around and actually maybe align a bit more closely with their badges. But we decided to pilot on the journal BMC Microbiology. It's an open access journal. It has that type 3 data sharing policy, which means all of the authors should be including a data availability statement. They publish a certain number of papers per week, per month. That meant it was just a good candidate for the pilot. The editors were interested in seeing if this made a difference to their authors. So during the pilot period, we were telling these BMC microbiology authors that we had a pilot in place, that if they decided to put their data in a repository, we would then give them a badge for it. So they were told this, but they weren't forced to participate. They were given the information and they could choose to do it or not. Their paper then was published by the journal BMC Microbiology, and they would have included a data availability statement. My team checked to see had they put that data in a repository, and then we used a platform called badger.io to create this badge that was then added to that author's paper. You can see here, this is an example of a badged paper in BMC Microbiology. So that's a little badge icon, and there's a clickable link out where you can get a bit more information about where those data are, so what repository they're in. So looking at the initial results of the pilot, it looked really positive. So before the pilot started, we'd done a check to see, well, how many authors are sharing in a repository, how many would have gotten a badge. And only 20% of authors were doing so. And then after our pilot started and we started offering badges for authors who put data in a repository, that jumped to 31. So that to us seemed very positive. It's not a huge sample size, but it seemed like a good result at that point. We did want to test our assumptions a bit. So the editor for the journal was concerned that actually authors weren't aware this was happening, and in journal publishing, like there's so much information for an author to read through as they submit to your journal. We know that authors often just skip over things that don't seem so relevant to them. Also, because of the area that these authors were publishing in, which is a lot of genetics content, there's already a strong community mandate for authors to share those data. So we can't say, well, it's just because these authors love badging. Their own community would be strongly encouraging them to do this. And also, we didn't notify the authors that they had a badge, so did they even know about it? So we did a survey subsequent to the early results of the pilot, just to check in and test our assumptions on what the results were. So we did a survey of authors who should have known that the pilot had happened. They'd been alerted to it. So we got quite a small number of responses, but you can see actually the majority of them didn't know that this was happening, so they hadn't even been aware. Only one of the authors who'd received a badge was aware of it. So it's very hard to conclude that actually having these open badges in place had made a difference to those authors' behaviour. Something else that we had looked at, though, was metrics in terms of reader engagement with badged articles. And again, like we did see quite a significant change because the journal average to download a paper, so clicks to download per paper was 12, and for the badge page, papers with badges, it was 53 clicks. The journal average, so I think this is monthly stats, the journal average page views for an article are 402, and that jumped to 695 if the paper had a badge. So we're still at the point where we need to investigate those metrics further, but it does seem to have some kind of impact for readers if they can tell very easily that a paper has open data associated with it. So thinking about data badging as an incentive, as I said, this is a project that we're hoping to continue to investigate. So it's quite a manual process to do the checks and to create the badges. So we're thinking maybe of how we can automate that a bit more. We did see an increase in data sharing during the pilot period. As I mentioned, it's certainly not clear that that related to badging. We can't rule out other factors without doing a bit more research. There was, however, a positive impact for papers being accessed and downloaded, which is definitely a benefit, and I think authors would find quite compelling. In general, so in the survey as well, we did ask authors how they felt about badging, and they're very positive about it, and editors the same. So there's a sense that this is something that they like the idea of it, although it doesn't seem to change practice. And I'd say in the context of this kind of incentive or reward, it's still not clear that this actually motivates change. So while people like the idea of it, it's not changing behavior. And we can see, I mean, from that BMC study that I mentioned, but other research that we've done internally, like having a strong policy with required actions where somebody checks that something's being done. So an editorial check happens to ensure compliance, has a much higher rate of compliance than just incentivizing something, which to an extent makes sense, I suppose. So just to mention, there's a couple of other initiatives that we're exploring at Springer Nature, and it would be the same at other academic publishers, to try and provide that credit or recognition for data sharing. So firstly, data citation. As I mentioned, all of our data sharing policies at Springer Nature do support the citation of data sets in reference lists. So this idea that citing a data set citation should be just as important as a citation to a published paper, and including the data set in reference lists helps to do that. And then secondly, data publishing options in peer-reviewed journals. So we have actually a number of journals at Springer Nature and other publishers do too, that focus purely on publishing data articles. So that would be an article where the author is explaining how their data set was generated, their methodology, how the data set could be reused, without so much of a focus on hypothesis testing or results. So the examples I have there, so Scientific Data is a pure data journal. That's the only type of paper that they would publish. BA as a data article type called a data node that would do something similar. So looking at other ways to allow researchers who have a data set they want to share to feel that they're getting that credit for having done so. Okay, so just some closing thoughts, and I think it's pretty obvious that I haven't solved the problem of incentivizing researchers to share their data. But what I have seen is there's been significant developments in data management policies in Ireland since 2014. So those kind of push factors of having stronger data policies, they're certainly coming into force. So that's going to be a big change for researchers anyway. On the other hand, we do know from our survey data that researchers don't necessarily feel motivated to do something just because the stakeholder has a policy for it. So even in the case of funders or publishers, where potentially you can't receive your funding, you can't get published without doing something, researchers still don't find that to be motivating. And they've told us that they would find credit to be more motivating than policy compliance and policy change. So I think what we still need to do some work around is what form that credit should take. And I think it's not something that publishers can solve or any of the stakeholders individually, but it's something that I think will need to change if we want this to be more than just policy compliance for researchers. So that was my last slide. Thank you very much. I have some information here. This is my contact details at Springer Nature. We have the email address for the help desk, so it's researchdata@springernature.com, and we answer any researcher queries around sharing research data in our journals. And just to acknowledge my dual affiliation here, I also have contact details at UCD, supervised by Dr. Elizabeth Mullins in the School of History. So thank you very much. I think if there were any questions, Sandra will kindly relay them to me.
Sandra, you are muted.
Okay, Rebecca, thanks very much. That was really interesting. I wish I was in the room with you, but that was really, really clear with the slides. So I've been gathering up the questions that we received during, and I have a few myself. But let me get started. So sorry, first of all, Rebecca, I was thinking it's always very strange not to get a round of applause afterwards. So here's a little mini. Okay, so during the talk, Chris Wood had a question which was about response rate. What was the response rate for the state of open data? And I suppose generally,
That's a really
do
good
you
question.
get good responses to the surveys?
Yeah, so I'd have to check the various state of open datas and the white papers to be exact. But as far as I know, they do get a very high response rate. So, and again, I think people are a little bit influenced maybe by the fact that it's nature asking you to do a survey. So we do tend to get good response rates. What we did find in actually across the surveys is we didn't get so many responses from researchers in Asia. So we conducted a second round of surveys in China and Japan in, I think that was 2018, that then got published separately as like focusing on those regions, and then also got pulled into that 5 essential factors report. And I believe, so at the time that we published it was the practical challenges in sharing research data in 2018. It was the biggest scale survey of its kind that had been done, I think. So as far as I know, like if that's the type of data you're trying to gather about researcher perspectives, I believe it's one of the biggest surveys.
Brilliant, thanks, Rebecca. Chris had a follow-up question, and it's something that I was thinking about as well, and it's really on the question of what incentivizes people to do this. So Chris's question was your drop-down options. Your options were about mostly focused on compliance, I guess, so funders and policies. Do you find people motivated by the idea of public good? You know, it's the right thing to do. Does that enter into it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I mentioned at the very start, like what we see so I'd say there's a small number of individual researchers who feel very, very strongly about this and the public good, and the public good seems to tie in quite a bit with their perspective. But from then looking at things like policy compliance and the responses we get to surveys, it doesn't necessarily rate as highly as, like, it's not as motivating as you might hope that it would be at this point. Like that said, I don't have the stats for it, but there was another question we did ask on one of the surveys about again, it was about motivations and incentives, and it's not that it rated low, it just didn't rate as highly as things like credit, as far as I remember. So okay. I would say if you're relying on that, it doesn't necessarily motivate all researchers. Well, I guess it's obvious.
Yeah, that is interesting. I saw something really interesting in behavioral economics, and you know, you need a large percentage of the public to be acting for the public good before like it really needs a kind of a bulk buy-in, which is, I suppose, something we're seeing with the public good measures for COVID-19. I have another question for you, Rebecca, and this is from Joel, who also said it was an excellent presentation. And the question is, any thoughts about how to incentivize the sharing of qualitative data in particular?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And in my own research, that's what I was generating. So in Ireland, there's the Qualitative Data Archive, which are just such a hub of resources. But what I found, particularly talking to, so we do a lot of training with international researchers, and just there's a general sense that the guidance that's available and the way research data sharing is talked about excludes qualitative data. So that even though I think a lot of the principles are quite similar, people who generate that kind of data feel like they're being excluded or they're not being acknowledged. So one of the projects I'm working on at Springer Nature at the moment is around inclusivity for HSS researchers. And the first thing we're doing is changing language in the policies. So where someone's publishing in a social sciences journal, the information we're giving them resonates, and we're not just talking about sequencing data, which I think there's quite a tendency to do. And then like in terms of explicit incentives for those researchers with qualitative data, I think we just need to be better about communicating that the benefits are the same. So if you're interested in things like data citation or more citations for your paper, it's just the same for you as a researcher with qualitative data as for the life scientist.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, that examples you can identify with, I guess, is really important. I have a question from David as well. So your data about the badges working, so I guess there's more to learn about that, but that they might be an incentivizer. David's question is, do you think, so where the researcher publishes the data or where they store it for preservation, do you think a badging system for institutional repositories or wherever people would store their data, would that be a double incentive? Would that work?
So I've spoken to a generalist repository about a similar project, and it's something they were also interested in. And the impression that I got from them is that through their own pilots of this kind of badging, they found that it didn't really make a difference. So there seems to be a sense that people like the idea, but when it comes to doing something different or changing practice, they're not going to go that far. Like, they'd like a badge if they had it, but it's not going to make them do anything. But I don't know as much about the institutional repository perspective, but I've had a couple of pretty interesting conversations with the repository about it, and I feel like we were in a similar place in terms of being a little bit skeptical that it would do anything for the majority of researchers.
Okay, it's interesting. Yeah, so when you're talking, this is a question from me, I was fascinated about the increase in reporting downloads and data sharing. You don't have any data or findings around people actually reusing the data, that kind of secondary research.
Yeah, it's so hard to capture that. So like we've got a few different projects that I've worked on at Springer Nature around supporting research data sharing, encouraging better data availability statements. But the problem is that the impacts of those are seen so far down the line. Like, you could wait 3 years to get a citation from something that you just published. So like this project, like the data badges that just finished up in January, where we might see an explosion in citations in 2 years, but it's too early to say. The other thing that we can look at is more the altmetric level data from the repository. So things like, was this data set downloaded a lot of times? Was it tweeted about? Was it in policy documents? And the problem we had there is finding a good point of comparison. So like, what's a good number of times for a data set about lemurs to be cited? Like, would it have been cited less times if they hadn't had a badge or not? It's really hard to assess. So like that study that I mentioned that included the BMC journals, they did like a computational analysis of 500,000 papers, and I think that's where you really get the compelling data, because one of their findings was that there's they associated data sharing with a 25% increase in citations to papers, and that kind of evidence is like, that's what researchers I think would find a bit more compelling than, well, we badged 200 papers and we saw 10 extra downloads.
Rebecca, a question from Natalie Harrower, the director of the DRI. She's pointed out that NORF, so our National Open Research Forum, that would have followed from the original principles of open access, they're creating a roadmap for open science implementation in Ireland. So you've some great data gathered there. They're going to do work in setting out that roadmap. What would you advise is the other things that should be studied in order to figure out what we need to do next?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So at a kind of personal level. Like I've done a much bigger mapping of a number of initiatives that have kind of led us to where we are, that I would be absolutely delighted to share with anyone who's interested. Like I gave such a brief overview. And then what I've also done in my research is looking at the UK for a number of reasons. Like they're close to us. They're like up until now have been subject to similar legislation at an EU level. They do a really good job of mapping. The DCC does a great job of mapping current activities, and they've had similar drivers to us. So like in the work that I've been doing, that's what I've been kind of using as a reference point. And I think you can't look at Ireland or any country outside of the global context. So if you can find a point of comparison to see what, like, where everyone else is at, which I'm sure North are doing, then like I think that can be a really useful way to frame it.
Can I ask you completely on the fly, what would you say, how would you say Ireland is doing? Like,
yeah,
hot, not?
Yeah, so yeah, they're good. So I did a bit of a benchmarking that I didn't include in the slides because it's like from a research perspective, I think it's important for me to be able to do that, but I'm not sure how useful it is for everyone to kind of benchmark it against different regions. And in terms of policy coverage, our funders and our universities have greater coverage than the UK, which was my point of comparison. When I first started looking in 2014, I would say we were behind. So because we had so few policies, when we looked at comparable countries, we weren't doing as well objectively maybe, but that's really changed. Like in terms of policy coverage, in terms of kind of strategic national level activity, yeah, we're very strong, I would say.
Oh, that's really good to hear. I think there are some stars in our Irish funding agencies I've been really impressed with, and that has made a difference. Like seeing your findings from 2014 versus 2020, like that's a big jump. It's really positive to see. The follow up to that one, Rebecca, then, so we're doing better and we're doing well, but where would you guess we are on the journey to open science? You know, are we a third of the way there, quarter?
I mean, yeah, that's hard to answer because I'm not sure what open science looks like necessarily. If it means something like Plan S and all open access publishing, or like something that some of our authors and our editors talk about a lot is, why don't you have stricter policies? Like, to me, the research communities aren't ready for that yet. Like I'd say we get far more pushback on our policies that just require data availability statements than we get positive feedback on our policies that require something more than that. So I'd say, yeah, I mean, I don't think Ireland's any further behind than any other country in terms of open science, but I'm not sure what the destination looks like necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we have a nirvana in our heads of what the goal is, but yeah, it seems it's hard to picture all the pieces it would take to really achieve free flow of open data for open science.
And I do think there's there's only so far that stakeholders like funders and publishers and universities can go like on their own. So I think there's still like I think the reason that it's quite hard to look for incentives and credit mechanisms is because there's just no value to the kind of credit we can give at the moment. Like, what does a researcher do with the fact that they have a data citation? Like, how does that feed into their own career progression?
Exactly. And I think that's a really key thing for the academic institutions to value that in career progression. And I see a load of great work going on across the research institutions in encouraging scientists, researchers, humanities scholars, you know, people to consider this and take it into their workflows. But it's a really big commitment. What would you say? So where would you, this is another question from Natalie. So if we were to inject help, what sector or discipline, like where would benefit the most from focusing on, do you think?
Like if you mean research discipline, then I'm very biased, because I would say humanities and social sciences. We're so ill served by most of the guidance and training and policy documentation out there. And like obviously the Digital Repository of Ireland is like the complete exception to that. But generally speaking, like even in the disciplines where you would think there's such strong community mandates and practice for data sharing, like you still find researchers who don't have the experience to know what they need to do, don't understand why it's important. There's also quite a lot of fear that I wasn't anticipating around things like getting scooped. So yeah, I think so. If you mean where should money go generally to support things changing, I would say training. If you mean towards supporting specific disciplines, I would say HSS.
Okay, good vote. And another question for you then. So I think you've really identified some key drivers for change. So the universities, research institutions, and the funders. But who is there somebody else, some other important levers or change makers?
Yeah, I guess like the who I see being left out of the conversation most often would be the researchers themselves. Because like I do find that often when you are speaking on an individual level to a researcher, they feel like the policies that apply to them don't acknowledge their actual research practice. And I do think that RDA has done a very good job of trying to bring researchers in to be part of the conversation. But in terms of the like other major stakeholders, like I think one that I found in my research, again, that I wasn't necessarily expecting was kind of government departments. So the is it Jobs, Enterprise and DEGI, and like a lot of the work around the open government data, like it overlaps and intersects very much with what's happening with academic data sharing as well. And I think, again, we don't necessarily think of them as a key stakeholder, but there's so much work happening there as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the open data and the PSI has a huge intersection too. Rebecca, what about libraries, archives, repositories? What do we need to do?
Yeah, like I think like in terms of providing support and guidance, like that is where it's coming from. The funders too, and then some publishers also do quite a good job. But I find like most of the support is coming from libraries, and most of the upskilling has happened at libraries in terms of people preparing themselves to provide this kind of support to researchers. Like you did mention archives, and that's obviously the area of my PhD research, because I feel like as an archivist, we're also kind of an underutilized community that could be providing this kind of support to researchers, but maybe aren't necessarily at the moment. In terms of doing more, like, to be honest, when I see so again, looking at University College Dublin, it's my own institution, I don't know how much more they could do. Like they provide like the guidance and support, and also like one-on-one support that they provide is pretty amazing. I don't know, did you have something in mind, Sandra?
No, I suppose, I mean, I think that we have to be a key part in it. And it's just, yeah, I suppose it's a balance of what is possible, because there are so many researchers, so many different types of research data, and the role as really an intermediary, and I suppose as well the importance of the preservation of the data. If we want to see the downstream benefits of this, we need to know that data is going to be somewhere safe. Yeah,
that's so true, because I think that's another kind of significant gap where there's not so much conversation happening. So that idea of preservation, it's another thing researchers get a bit confused by. So what does it mean to preserve something? How long should it be preserved for? And certainly a role for libraries and archives there.
One last one, I think, Rebecca. So we talked like this, you really dug into it on incentives and compliance. I mean, I guess I wish the world was such that incentives was the answer. But do you think in the end, like, is compliance the one that is more likely to make a difference?
So I guess I'll just speak from the perspective of working at an academic publisher. So at the same time as looking at incentives, another big part of my role is, so we're not just rolling out more policies, we're actually strengthening them. So we've got a big project at the moment to move quite a large proportion of those journals that already have a policy onto a stronger policy. And I think we have kind of our strategy at the moment is to bring in policies where someone, so it's not just that someone's checking that you've done something correctly, they're also at that point probably giving you some feedback. So if this is something you haven't done before, maybe you're a bit reluctant, at the point where you're being asked to do it, someone's actually going to help you as well. So I think we'll continue to look at options for credit and incentive, but I think currently policy compliance is where it's at.
I have one, that was, it turned out was my second last question. One very, very last question. Rebecca, have you been following EOSC and European moves for open science? And, you know, how do you think that fits versus the member state or the national movements?
Yeah, so I have, to an extent. I'd say I haven't been particularly following it closely, as in it's not kind of forming a part of my current research. Like, I think it's pretty clear that like what happens at an EU level has big knock-on effects at the member state level, and if that includes something like the development of infrastructure, like I'm still excited to see what that looks like to see how it solves the problems that we have, and like to have a critical mass of like to have something of the size of the commission working on something like EOSC is obviously going to be very impactful. On the other hand, I don't think it means that at a national level you just wait for EOSC to happen and for the EU to bring in policy that then you have yourself at a national level.
Yeah, I think we have a chance really to make a difference here, so let's grab it. Rebecca, I got messages as well during your talk, the Q&A, thanks and compliments from Killian and Jenny. And this is usually where we'd give you a round of applause. So again, I'm going to do a very mini one.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was really great. Yeah, thanks a mil. I think we're going to finish up now. Tamea has a last slide for us to give you where to go to learn more about the Research Data Alliance. We mentioned COVID briefly during the talk, and there's a great initiative in RDA at the moment to enable data sharing to get towards solving COVID-19. So we'd highlight that and say that's worth a read. As well, Tamea has been doing interviews with people across Ireland in the open data, the data science sharing space, research data space, and those are available on the website to follow up with. And the last to say is that thanks to Rebecca for this. That was really great and very well communicated. And the slides and the video will be available, and we'll send them out, link to it on the website afterwards as well. So thanks very much, everybody, on a sunny Friday during your lunchtime. It was really lovely to have that feedback and conversation through it. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and we'll be back with more. Thanks.